The American people deserve to hear the truth about his son and those 16 other men and the other Americans that were on that chopper. Will you please join me in welcoming Billy Vaughn?
And I began to see why we have a military that's the greatest the world has ever seen, but we can't win a war. Very early on into it, I learned and I read about the Operational Coordination Group of Afghanistan that we had to clear every operation with. I found out later from a man who was involved in that part of it in the Army that we did not vet the Operational Coordination Group. Our military was not allowed to vet them. They were vetted by village imams. And then they were put in their positions. They had all the intel that we had. They could squash any mission. Mr. Ferris asked us if we'd ever received our copy of the ramp ceremony. The ramp ceremony is when the bodies are loaded, from an overseas base and flown home. And my wife, Karen, said, no, we didn't. I don't think any of the parents did. And he said, I'll get you one. And then a little bit later in the conversation, he said, I want you to know that the rest of your son's team was very upset at the ramp ceremony because an Afghan was allowed to speak. And so they left, and in 2 weeks we hadn't gotten it. And so my wife emailed him and said we hadn't received it yet. And he wrote back and said, it's been a lot more red tape to get you one than I thought. I'll send you mine. And we got it the next day. We left it laying around the house there for a good 2 weeks because we weren't looking forward to looking at it. Well, one Saturday morning, we did. And it was a very somber ceremony on the American base, all the way up to the point an American chaplain prayed, and then an Afghan began to chant. And we immediately looked at each other and said, we gotta know what he's saying. Karen pulled just the audio off of the disc, no pictures, just his audio, no American talking or anything. So the interpretation we got would not be biased in any way. We got it to a friend who got it to a Middle East military expert, called me the next day and said, the Afghan says that the Muslims are the winners, the infidels are fodder for hellfire, and the infidels are the losers. Karen and I were able, with some other families, able to hold a press conference in Washington, D.C. about what had happened, and we played the DVD. And the military was offended. In fact, DevGru was offended. Even though it's there, DevGru was offended to the fact that Captain Howard called us when we were driving home from D.C., told us we weren't welcome at DevGru at our son's memorial that year on Memorial Day. Because he was offended at what we had done to General Joseph Votel, who was the general who, right after the Afghan spoke, bragged, talked inspiringly about how good comrades and brothers the Afghan soldiers were, and all of them, were in this fight together. What I didn't realize then, that I have realized in the time since then, the catastrophic failure of our government leadership in Afghanistan is the same catastrophic failure that we as Americans are experiencing in our country. And you could have never convinced me, an American, that we could lose a war to a primitive enemy made formidable by our American government. But we did. We lost 2 wars to them. And if we could lose that war, we can lose it right here. And folks, I'm saying that because we have never identified the enemy. And here in this country, what is it you hear every time there's a jihadi attack? Almost without exception, the FBI comes out and says, we were watching them. I'll tell you what, as one American, I'm sick and tired of them watching them and ending up with dead Americans. This has to cease. Thank you very much. And let me tell you something, folks. The reason for this is because they do not understand the threat doctrine. They do not recognize the enemy. Our warfighters did. We've talked to so many who fought them night after night, who knew exactly who this enemy was. And you know what I'll also say? Many and most of you probably do. But our government, because of political correctness, because of relationships, and because of money and favors, will not recognize this enemy.